A family falls victim to a violent home intrusion.
There was blood just about on every wall.
The only thing that could cause that type of carnage was shotgun.
Had someone targeted this unsuspecting family?
Police thought maybe this jealous rage was something to do with the murders.
As investigators peel back the curtain on a horrific crime, they uncover a sordid romance fueled by deviant desires.
These were two desperate people who kind of found each other.
And at the heart of it all is a family betrayal that no one saw coming.
I said, I don't want you to have it. I don't care what you don't want.
If I had been able to connect the dots, I would have known that I was looking into the eyes of evil. It was like living in a horror movie.
Danville, Virginia, October 30th, 2002. It's just before 4 a.m. when the local sheriff's office receives a frantic call.
We received a call from a female stating that some people had broken into her residence and shot her husband and her stepson.
Within minutes, deputies arrive on the scene and meet a panicked woman who identifies herself as the 911 caller.
She told me her name was Teresa Lewis. My immediate thought then was, we have to get this residence clear.
We asked her to move away, and we both entered the house.
The deputies go room by room, searching for the victims or any suspects who might still be on the scene.
I have no idea if a perpetrator is still armed and barricaded or in the home.
I go down a small hallway. There's a bathroom to the left, and just beyond the bathroom is a bedroom. As soon as I break the threshold of the bedroom, there's a male subject with tremendous bullet wounds.
Blood splatter almost on everything in the room.
I checked for vitals. I didn't feel anything. I knew that he was deceased.
The victim is identified as Teresa's stepson, C.J. Lewis. Meanwhile, deputies continue into the house in search of Teresa's husband, Julian.
As we're getting closer to the master bedroom of the residence, we start to hear a low moaning sound. So we break the threshold of that bedroom, and on the other side of the bed, we see a second victim.
He was on the floor. He had multiple open, gaping, bleeding wounds, but he was still alive.
I lean over, I said, "Sir, this is the sheriff's office. What is your name?" He mumbles, he's able to say, "Julian Lewis."
An Army veteran and a father of three, Julian Lewis had lived in the small town of Danville, Virginia his entire life.
My dad was born at the Memorial Hospital of Danville. He was the first baby born in January 1st of 1951. He graduated high school and enlisted in the Army for the Vietnam War. He returned here where he met my mother, and this has always been his home. Our family dynamic was my father, Julian, my mother, Joyce, me, and being the oldest, and then there was Jason and CJ. Jason had a really wicked sense of humor. CJ was extremely special. He was always a joy to have around. He always kept you laughing. The values that my father instilled in us were always to be upstanding citizens of the community and the world, to do for other people, and to be the person that somebody would come to when they needed help.
Julian's military influence rubbed off on all three of his children. His two sons, Jason and CJ, followed in their father's footsteps and enlisted in the armed forces, while oldest daughter Kathy served in a different way, caring for their ailing mother and Julian's first wife, Joyce.
My mother was sick as long as I can remember. She had chronic debilitating pancreatitis. I remember as a child pushing a chair up to this stove to be able to cook for Jason and CJ because my mom would be sick. But she did the very best that she could, and she fought that disease as hard as she possibly could.
In January of 2000, Joyce Lewis sadly lost her battle to her disease. No one in the family took it harder than Julian.
It devastated Dad. He was deeply depressed when Mom passed. He would go a couple days without eating. I mean, he still went to work, but he would drink real heavy.
At the time of his wife's passing, Julian had been working as an electrician at a local textile mill after retiring from the Army. And it was at the mill that he met the person who would help him turn his life around. Her name was Teresa Bean.
She worked in the textile mill as a weaver, and with him being the lead electrician, he spent a lot of his time in the weave room, and that's how they met.
Like Julian, Teresa was suffering from a recent heartbreak. The divorced mother of two had lost custody of both her children after struggling with addiction to prescription pills.
I was a reporter covering this case at the time. I interviewed Teresa multiple times. She had an accident that caused her to need pain pills, but then it spiraled out of control and addiction took hold.
Teresa's marriage was very tumultuous, and when it ended, he kept custody of the children, and he held on to the custody of the children, wouldn't even allow her visitation.
But Teresa had been able to kick her habit and get her life back on track. And her blossoming friendship with Julian seemed to help him with his own depression.
When Mom passed, Teresa was the first person to really show him any attention or any kind of affection.
A connection sparked between the couple. Within weeks, their friendship turned romantic.
He did things for her, and he tried to make sure that she was taken care of.
Teresa was looking for a stable environment. She was always looking for that person that was just going to make everything okay.
Just 3 months into their relationship, Julian proposed, and Teresa said yes.
She thought, this is my chance to be with somebody who's going to take care of me and who's going to provide that family I've been looking for.
Julian's children, however, weren't excited about their father getting remarried less than 6 months after their mother had passed away.
Jason and I were so upset with him. We felt like Dad had betrayed her by starting dating so early. He didn't even give himself time enough to grieve her. CJ had a very close relationship with our father. CJ, there being the peacekeeper, felt like he needed to show that he was still his son and he still loved him.
The 3 siblings ultimately decided to keep their feelings to themselves. But not long after the wedding, the Lewis family was rocked by tragedy when Julian's oldest son suffered a devastating accident.
My oldest brother, Jason, was active military, and he had come in on leave for Thanksgiving, and he had taken an extended leave to stay. He was due to be on duty December 16th. He was on his way back to Dad's house. He lost control of his vehicle, and he was actually killed in a car wreck.
After his son's death, Julian received a life insurance payout from the military.
Jason had a considerable life insurance policy, of which my father was beneficiary of.
Julian received the payout from the insurance in the sum of $200,000. And of course, people are going to say, well, $200,000, that's a lot of money. That money does not compare to losing a child.
My father, he didn't want to continue to live where they were at because on his way to work, he had to drive by the site where my brother died, and it was killing him, and he said he couldn't do it. So they found a patch of land, and they moved out there using the insurance money.
The sudden windfall also seemed to give Teresa and Julian more time to focus on each other as they attempted to put the tragedy behind them. A year later, in October of 2002, the couple seemed in good spirits as they spent time with Julian's second son, CJ, who was in the Army and scheduled to soon deploy overseas.
He actually had a room at Dad's where he had things kept, so that's where he stayed. But we had made plans to meet for dinner, and I was actually almost falling asleep on the phone with him. He said, well, you sound so tired. He said, so I'm just going to go ahead and end the call and tell you that I love you and I'll see you tomorrow.
But that very night, the Lewis family falls victim to a terrifying home invasion.
Teresa Lewis had called 911 and said that someone had come into the house in the middle of the night and shot her husband and her stepson.
CJ had been shot in the chest, the abdomen, the back, the face, and the neck.
It was just very obvious that he was deceased.
In the master bedroom, Julian has also been shot, but he's still clinging to life.
He slumped over, very bad shotgun wound to his left shoulder, and he starts saying, baby, baby.
Everything in me said, just leave him as he is, try and comfort him, talk to him, and wait for the EMS to get there.
Coming up, as paramedics tend to Julian, police try to learn who attacked the family.
She said they were woken up by someone standing at the bottom of the bed.
And a rumor suggests the Lewis family might have been targeted for revenge.
He was supposed to have been Julian's friend.
Police thought maybe this jealous rage was something to do with the murders.
Police and paramedics are trying to save the life of 51-year-old Julian Lewis after his wife, Teresa, reported that the family had been attacked by an armed home intruder. Julian's 25-year-old son, CJ, had been killed in the same attack.
Julian had massive abdominal wounds, but not actually killing him, leaving him gurgling in his own blood.
He was moaning, but we were asking him, do you know what happened?
Tragically, there's nothing paramedics can do.
He succumbed to his injuries and passed there.
Kathy Clifton is notified of her father and brother's deaths later that morning.
When I got to work, my supervisor put his arm around me. He says, I hate to be the one to tell you, but your father and brother were murdered last night in their homes. It was like it was kind of like living in a horror movie. And I broke down.
Detectives with the Pittsylvania County Sheriff's Office are now faced with a double homicide.
Investigator Barrett, our lead investigator for the crime scene program, he arrives with the crime scene unit.
When I went inside the home, I noticed that it was neat and it was an orderly home until you got into the master bedroom where Mr. Lewis was. And then it was quite the scene. There was blood spatter throughout that room. Also, we had noticed that there were shot shell casings in the floor.
Down the hall, detectives find an equally gruesome scene.
I went to where CJ Lewis was, and as soon as I entered, there's numerous wounds to him as well.
The only thing that could cause that type of carnage to a body at close range was a shotgun.
I noticed in the master bedroom where Julian Lewis was that there were shotgun shells in the floor. In the room where CJ was, there were none of those in the floor. So it made me wonder, why do I have shot shells in the floor in this room and not in the second room? We're photographing, we're taking measurements, we're trying to figure out what has happened.
At that point, you just can't tell for sure. So you look for motive, why did the homicide happen? Was there evidence of forced entry? Was the house ransacked?
This area had been seeing a rash of burglaries. So perhaps the person who's been doing all these other robberies is the person who did this one, and it went bad.
In the kitchen, detectives find evidence to support the burglary theory.
There was a pair of jeans laying on a chair at the kitchen table. And inside those jeans was a wallet, and there was no money inside the wallet.
Outside, detectives make another telling discovery.
I found one shoe impression just outside the back door. So I took that casting for further comparison if we were ever able to find a shoe to possibly, match to. It was unlike any other shoe print that I had seen of any shoes inside the house. It was an indicator that possibly this could have been the shooters.
But where had the shooter fled? While a team of officers continues to process the scene for evidence, detectives circle back to Teresa Lewis to take her statement on what happened.
You want to get into the victims' lives. Do they have any enemies? Have they had any issues with anyone recently? Is it anyone that would want to cause them harm?
Teresa tells detectives that she can't think of any enemies her husband or stepson might have. And she says nothing had seemed out of the ordinary the night before. But several hours after they had gone to bed, she had been startled awake by the sound of an intruder entering their bedroom.
She said they were woken up by a noise and saw someone standing at the bottom of the bed. She jumped up and ran into the bathroom and barricaded herself in the bathroom. And then she heard gunshots. And then she heard several more gunshots.
She said she was in the bathroom, locked in fear, was worried that this intruder was possibly still in the house. So she wanted to make sure that the coast was clear before she got out of the bathroom and placed that call to 911.
Teresa tells police she didn't get a good look at the intruder, and she doesn't know who it might have been. But detectives can't help but zero in on something odd about her demeanor as she answers their questions.
For someone that just experienced what should be the most traumatic incident in their life, there was no hysteria, there was no... And I can't place why or if it's her norm. Is it shell shock?
Some people shut down when they find themselves in that trauma. Sometimes people shut down because they don't want anyone to know what actually happened.
Not willing to take any chances, investigators asked Teresa to submit to a gunshot residue test.
What we do is we will dab the hands with the collection tool, and that is packaged and submitted to the lab, and they examine for any gunshot residue that's on that.
The gunpowder residue came back negative. So almost immediately they think, well, we should set our sights on someone else.
While evidence at the scene suggests a possible burglary, police aren't willing to rule out that the motive behind the shootings might be personal. With that theory in mind, detectives dig into both victims' backgrounds.
We start focusing on Julian. You go into his work, talking to his coworkers, what type of person he was, type of lifestyle did he live.
When police speak with Julian's relatives, they learn that the man could have a hot streak at times, especially when it came to his wife Teresa and her interactions with other men.
Julian was kind of the jealous type. When he would see Teresa talking to other men, younger than he was.
According to members of the couple's church, Julian had been particularly suspicious about Teresa's relationship with one of the church's deacons.
There was a deacon that was supposed to have been Julian's friend, and while Julian was working, this deacon of the church would come pick up Teresa and take her to church.
There had been some suggestion by Julian that there had been an affair between Teresa and the deacon.
Julian's suspicion had eventually erupted into a heated conflict between the two men.
That confrontation was apparently pretty hostile and created quite a scene. Police thought maybe this jealous rage was something to do with the murders.
Coming up, a new report puts the spotlight on a person of interest.
That's when police started to get suspicious about the timeline here.
And a web of deception begins to unravel.
You can look at what she's saying and tell that she's not telling the whole truth.
After 51-year-old Julian Lewis and his 25-year-old son CJ are found shot to death inside Julian's Danville, Virginia home, police are looking into a recent confrontation Julian had with a local church deacon.
Julian believed that there had been an affair between Teresa and the deacon. Police thought maybe this angry, jealous, lover tension thing that was going on between the deacon and Julian, maybe this was what caused the murders.
When detectives speak with the church deacon, he denies the rumors that he and Teresa were having an affair. He says Julian misinterpreted his friendly but strictly platonic relationship with Teresa. The deacon also insists that he had nothing to do with the murders and provides police with an alibi for his whereabouts the night of the shootings.
The deacon was ultimately ruled out, and it was determined that he and Teresa did not have an affair.
The next day, Julian and CJ's autopsy reports come back from the medical examiner's office. And there's one specific detail that stands out to detectives: the approximate timing of CJ's death.
This happened around 3:15, and Teresa didn't call 911 until 3:55.
Police determined it had been 45 minutes from the time that this event had happened till Teresa dialed 911.
Teresa had claimed that she waited in the bathroom after the shootings until she knew the coast was clear. But to detectives, 45 minutes seems like a long time to wait when your loved ones are injured.
If she'd have made that phone call earlier, you could have been able to save Mr. Lewis.
So that's when police started to get suspicious about the timeline here.
Detectives decide to take a closer look at Teresa and into what she's been up to in the days since the murders. They discover an incident from the same day as the shootings that raises red flags.
She called Julian's boss to advise him that he wouldn't be coming into work that day because he had been the victim of a homicide. And then she inquired about when she could get his paycheck.
He told her, due to the legalities of the situation, with an ongoing investigation, that he could not release those funds to her.
But Teresa hadn't stopped there. Investigators are soon alerted to another suspicious exchange between Teresa and a teller at a local bank.
We went to the bank that Julian Lewis had an account with, and I met the subject there, and he said, yeah, I have a check for $50,000 that Teresa Lewis had come in here and tried to cash. Well, the banks, they had the signature cards of both Julian Lewis and Teresa Lewis, and they looked at them and they could tell this does not appear to be Julian Lewis's signature.
And the teller refused to cash it, and Teresa calls the scene. By those actions, it just made the finger just point more and more at her.
Police knew through the gunpowder residue test that Teresa couldn't have been the shooter. But they do start to question whether she was behind the shooter. She was the motivation. And that's when they start to sort of assess the people around her who could possibly care this much about Teresa that they'd be willing to kill two people for her.
Detectives decide their best approach is to speak with Teresa again.
Hey, come on in.
They ask her to come in for a polygraph examination.
She came over voluntarily and agreed to speak with me.
Investigators start by asking Teresa to walk them back through the events of the shooting. They notice that she has a hard time remembering key details.
And I don't know if CJ was coming out of the bedroom to find out what's going on or what. We didn't hear the gunshots. You know, I didn't even hear the gunshots in the bathroom to his brain.
The polygraph readout also indicates that Teresa is being deceptive with her answers.
And they were trying to say, well, how many gunshots did you hear from the time they left the other room to his room? I said, I don't know. And I didn't, I don't know.
You can look at what she's saying and tell that she's not telling the whole truth. And I moved my chair, and I got knee to knee with her, and I talked to her and reasoned with her about what happened and pleaded with her to tell me what she knew.
I think I know what you did. Please tell me what you did then. Please tell me you killed your husband.
I think of the name, I can't think of it. I can't think of his name real bad.
You know his name.
Mm-hmm.
You know his name.
Matt,
It didn't take very long for her to tell me that she'd met a guy named Matthew Schallenberger.
Teresa tells police that Matthew Schallenberger is a 21-year-old man she'd befriended several weeks earlier after a chance encounter at a local store.
Teresa met Schallenberger while she was standing in the checkout line at a local department store.
Despite their 12-year age difference, Teresa admits her conversation with Matthew had quickly turned flirtatious. She'd been flattered by the younger man's attention, so when Matthew asked for her phone number, she gave it to him without a thought. A few days later, he called.
They struck up a conversation which led almost immediately to a sexualized and romantic relationship.
She was significantly older than him, and I think that you have to wonder why someone his age would be attracted to someone her age and with the kind of baggage she had. Both of them had had sort of pain in their past. Both of them had had addiction. Both of them had kind of grown up in a school of hard knocks and sort of making ends meet. These were two desperate people who kind of found each other in desperate situations, and right away there was a magnetic connection between them.
Teresa tells police that within a week, the casual fling she had expected with Matthew had evolved into a passionate love affair.
Teresa was at a point where she really wanted a connection. She really wanted to feel some sense of romance or passion in her life.
Teresa had also confided in Matthew a painful secret about her marriage.
She had shared with Matthew that her marriage was falling apart and that she felt abandoned and that she was desperately lonely.
The theme that she was trying to portray was that Julian was abusive and that he was very dominant and that he wasn't good to her. Matt did not like how Julian was treating Teresa. And so based on that, he was angry toward Julian.
I said, I don't want it to happen. He said, I don't care what you don't want.
So you knew it was gonna happen. So when he knocked on that door, you could have got up and woke Julian up and let Julian get his Glock 9 to protect himself, couldn't you?
I should have done that.
You didn't though, did you?
No.
You could have, didn't you? But you didn't. And you got up and you let him in, knowing what? He knew it, knowing he's gonna kill your husband.
It was a key turning point. Okay, Teresa, you're admitting that you're involved in it.
Coming up, police track down Matthew Schallenberger, and a new discovery changes everything police thought they knew about the crime.
We find 2 shotguns.
There were 2 people that they wanted to kill, so that would take another accomplice.
Authorities investigating the double murder of Julian Lewis and his son, CJ Lewis, have zeroed in on Julian's wife, Teresa, as their primary suspect. Teresa claims that her secret lover, Matthew Schallenberger, is the real killer and that he forced her into the murder plot.
Myself and another investigator went to where Matt supposedly lived at. I asked him if I could talk to him, and he said that he would speak with me. I asked him if he knew Teresa Lewis, and he said that he did know Teresa, and that they had known one another a couple of weeks, and that they had been intimate with one another.
Matthew admits he heard about the Lewis murders, but claims he wasn't involved. When detectives ask if he owns a shotgun, Matthew confirms that he does.
I asked him if he would give us consent to search his room, and he did give me consent. And he actually took me into the room that he had been staying at, and he pointed out where the shotgun was. It was under a bed in that bedroom. As I was continuing my search, in a closet in that bedroom, I found 4 yellow gloves. And then I continued to search that bedroom, and then I found another shotgun. And we recovered the weapon, and it had several shot shells in it. These shot shells are the same, as what I found the other day at Teresa Lewis's house. At that point, we were not going to leave without him, and he was taken into custody.
But the evidence collected from Matthew Schallenberger's home still leaves police with plenty of questions. Chief among them is whether Matthew had acted alone as the trigger man.
We find 2 shotguns, not 1 shotgun. And then we find 2 pairs of yellow rubber gloves. So it's indicating that maybe there were 2 people involved.
Was it possible Teresa was the second shooter? When police pose the question to Matthew Schallenberger, he refuses to answer.
He decides to stop talking.
With Matthew stonewalling, detectives turn back to Teresa. Faced with the evidence found inside Matthew's residence, Teresa admits there had been a second shooter. But it wasn't her.
She then passed on more information that Rodney Fuller was also involved.
Teresa tells detectives that Rodney is a friend of Matthew's who he had recruited to help commit the murders.
We were told that Rodney Fuller worked at a local seafood restaurant. And at that point, myself and another investigator, we went to the seafood restaurant and actually took Rodney Fuller in custody and took him to the sheriff's office where he was interviewed.
Unlike Matthew Schallenberger, Rodney Fuller makes it clear to police that he's completely willing to cooperate. He admits to helping Matthew commit the shootings, but then he drops a bombshell.
Rodney indicated that this was entirely Teresa's idea, that she had basically done this murder for hire because she wanted insurance money. She was seeing this as the possible start of a new life. I will be financially stable, I'll have a man who loves me, my life will be happy.
For Schallenberger, the intense sexualized relationship, the unbridled passion, the embrace of risk-taking was the glue for that relationship.
The 2 of them were sort of love-struck and were operating in a world that wasn't reality.
Rodney claims that Teresa and Matthew had approached him in early October and offered him money if he would help them commit their crime. Rodney also says that Teresa's plan had always been to kill both her husband and stepson.
She had convinced CJ to make her a secondary beneficiary on his life insurance policy in the case that something would happen to Julian.
What we've determined with all the evidence, all the statements, is that on the night that this happened, that Rodney Fuller and Matthew Schallenberger drove out into the rural area of Blairs, Virginia, eased down that road, got out of the vehicle, came through the back door that Teresa Lewis had left unlocked.
Schallenberger entered the master bedroom with the shotgun, and Teresa hid in the bathroom while her husband was shot repeatedly with the shotgun laying in his marital bed.
Rodney Fuller goes to the other end of the house, finds C.J. Lewis, and is shooting him at the same time. Teresa gave money to Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller that she had removed from Julian's wallet, and then they left. Julian Lewis is still on the floor, alive. Teresa Lewis waits a while before she calls 911. And when the officers finally get there, he's still alive.
Rodney's confession lines up with the evidence collected from the crime scene. Following his statement, police arrest all 3 suspects.
Teresa was arrested on the capital murder, and the 2 men were arrested on the conspiracy to commit.
I got a phone call, and I was told that she had been arrested. They had charged her. And I remember when I hung the phone up, I cried. That my family is everything to me. So why would you destroy it?
Coming up, charges are unveiled against the 3 conspirators.
She was the only one of the 3 charged with capital murder, and that was out of the ordinary.
But as their trial dates approach, will the lovers stand together?
A lot of people wonder if he sort of preyed upon her because she looked vulnerable. Some wonder if she blindly followed his lead on all of this.
1 week after her husband and stepson were killed, Teresa Lewis has been indicted for her role in the murders, along with her lover, Matthew Schallenberger, and their hired gun, Rodney Fuller. And the formal charges are a surprise to many.
Teresa was the only one of the 3 charged with capital murder. And that was out of the ordinary because she was not the trigger person.
Teresa was definitely urging this process along. She offered that information that there was this insurance policy. And Matthew would have never known that policy existed had Teresa not offered it as a motive to go through with this.
Shortly after their charges are announced, attorneys for both Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller approach prosecutors about possible plea deals.
They both pled guilty and were willing to cooperate against the prosecution of Teresa Lewis.
But as Teresa's trial approaches, she also makes the decision to enter a plea.
She ended up pleading guilty, I'm sure in hopes that she would have been spared the death penalty.
At her sentencing hearing, prosecutors paint Teresa as a black widow who manipulated her younger lover into killing her husband and stepson for their hefty life insurance payouts.
Prosecutors were saying, does this look like a grieving wife? Does this look like somebody who just lost a stepson and her husband in a tragic murder? Someone who's trying to cash fraudulent checks at the bank? When Matthew showed up, she was so taken with him that she no longer had any sort of understanding of morality or right or wrong, and that she knew she just wanted to be with him so badly.
In the end, the judge gives Teresa the maximum penalty.
2 charges of capital murder.
The judge made it really clear that Teresa was the head of the serpent, that she was the mastermind of this awful plot, and therefore she deserved more than even the people who pulled the trigger. So Matthew and Rodney got life sentences. Teresa got death.
She was upset. She cried a lot. She says that she was sorry. She was scared for what was going to happen to her. I don't think that her remorse was for what she had done.
Following her conviction, Teresa becomes the only woman in Virginia on death row. Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller begin serving their life sentences in the Virginia Department of Corrections.
If there was anyone with conscience Rodney Fuller would have been the one, because he did ask for forgiveness.
He had sent me a letter prior, and he was very remorseful. I felt like he was actually the only one who was trying to do anything he could to make what he did right. Nothing would ever make it right. But I forgive him, and the only reason that I'm able to forgive him is because I know CJ would.
In 2006, Matthew Schallenberger commits suicide in prison.
You're not happy when somebody kills their self. I felt sorry for his family, but I'm glad I don't have to worry about him anymore.
Despite her attempts to appeal her sentence, Teresa's execution is scheduled for September 2010, 8 years after the murders.
My experience with Teresa was really leading up to her execution. I spoke to her just a few days before, and on the phone calls that we had from jail, she did express great remorse, and she did express deep sadness and a sense of spiritual enlightenment.
9 o'clock came, and they escorted her out, read her crimes and her sentence. When they strapped her down to the bed, there's a guy standing by the phone, just in case a phone call come in from the governor's office. 901 came, and they started the IV.
On September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis becomes the first woman to be executed by the state of Virginia in nearly a century.
Julian loved Teresa. He was in love with her, and Teresa used it.
CJ was extremely special. He was very conscientious, and he would give you the shirt off his back in the middle of a snowstorm if he thought you needed it more than he needed it. My father would lay his life down for his friends and his family. And he had a really tender side. I really miss him.
It begins not in darkness, but in light, bright studio lighting, polished floors. The controlled warmth of a British television set in 1989, where everything is designed to feel safe, familiar, even forgettable. A man sits among contestants on a game show called Bullseye, smiling politely, laughing at the right moments, answering questions with the ease of someone who belongs there. Nothing about him suggests urgency. Nothing about him suggests violence. He looks ordinary in the most disarming way possible. The kind of man you might pass in a supermarket aisle without a second glance. The audience claps, the host jokes, darts are thrown, and for a few minutes in time, John Cooper exists as just another contestant chasing a prize. But years later, investigators will rewind this same footage with a different kind of attention, the kind that comes from knowing what this man would become. And they will notice what no one in that studio could have known, that the face smiling under the studio lights belongs to someone already deep inside a pattern of violence that would leave entire communities in Wales permanently altered. Because only weeks after that broadcast, 2 tourists walking along a coastal path in Pembrokeshire would vanish into the landscape. And what should have been a peaceful holiday would end in one of the most disturbing double murders in modern Welsh history. To understand how those two realities connect, the television studio and the remote coastal path, you have to understand the illusion that surrounded John Cooper. An illusion built not on deception in the theatrical sense, but on the terrifying simplicity of looking ordinary. Pembrokeshire in the 1980s was a place defined by contrasts. On the surface, it was quiet, rural, almost cinematic in its natural beauty. A region of cliffs and walking trails where tourists came to escape noise and violence, not encounter it. Small towns like Milford Haven carried the rhythm of working life, familiar faces, predictable routines, and a sense that serious crime belonged elsewhere in cities far away. Yet beneath that calm, there were fractures. And into those fractures moved a man who had spent most of his life in the same region. Someone already known locally for volatility, alcohol-fueled aggression, and a long history of criminal behavior. John William Cooper, born in 1944 in Milford Haven, was not a hidden outsider in the traditional sense. He was part of the landscape, which in some ways made him harder to see clearly. His early life, as recorded through police encounters and local accounts, was marked by repeated conflict with authority and a pattern of escalating violence. He was not a man who drifted toward crime slowly and unknowingly. Rather, he moved through it as a repeated choice, accumulating arrests for theft, disorder, assault, and attacks on police officers during his early adulthood. Those who encountered him did not describe ambiguity. They described instability. Someone who could shift quickly from familiarity to hostility. Over time, that reputation settled into the community like a warning that was understood but not always acted upon. In 1978, his life took an unexpected turn when he won a substantial sum of money, around 90,000 pounds, through a competition known as Spot the Ball. For a brief moment, this windfall changed his circumstances, but not his trajectory. Instead of stabilizing his life, the money became fuel for a cycle that deepened his dependence on gambling and alcohol. When the money disappeared, so did any illusion of stability. What followed was not transformation, but acceleration. Burglaries, robberies, and increasingly bold acts of criminality began to define his path. And with each incident, the gap between how he appeared in public and what he was capable of widened. By the mid-1980s, residents in Pembrokeshire who knew of him did not think in terms of speculation. They thought in terms of avoidance. He was, in their words, unpredictable and dangerous. A man whose temperament made him difficult to anticipate and harder to confront. Yet even in a community aware of his reputation, nothing suggested the full scope of what was coming. Because the violence that would later define his name was not yet fully visible. It was building in fragments scattered across time, not yet connected into a coherent pattern. That pattern would reveal itself through two sets of victims whose lives never intersected except through the actions of one man. In December 1985, Richard Thomas and Helen Thomas were at their home in Scufston Park, near Milford Haven, living what appeared to be a quiet rural life. They were not figures of public attention, not involved in anything that would suggest danger or exposure. Their home, a private estate property, should have represented isolation in the benign sense, distance from risk, distance from intrusion. But that isolation became a vulnerability when John Cooper entered their lives through an act that began as burglary and ended in irreversible violence. Around that time, the sequence of events inside the house escalated rapidly, transforming what may have been intended as theft into something far more catastrophic. Cooper used a shotgun to kill both Richard and Helen Thomas inside their home, and then, in an act that would later complicate forensic understanding, he set fire to the property in an attempt to destroy evidence. When emergency responders arrived, they were met with a structure already consumed by flames, the fire erasing much of what could have been known. In the early stages of investigation, the case appeared to fit a pattern familiar to law enforcement, a burglary gone wrong. Violence erupting during an intrusion, followed by arson intended to conceal the crime. There were no clear witnesses, no preserved forensic traces that could point decisively toward a suspect, and, as a result, the case settled into uncertainty. It did not resolve. It simply stopped moving forward. Years later, it would still be unresolved, waiting in a file that held more questions than answers. 4 years after that fire, in June 1989, another pair of lives would intersect with the same offender in a completely different setting. Peter Dixon and Gwenda Dixon were visiting Pembrokeshire as tourists, drawn by the coastline and its walking routes, the kind of journey made for leisure and simplicity. They set out along a coastal path, a space that should have offered openness and visibility, and never returned. Their disappearance triggered a search that expanded across the region, reflecting the urgency of missing persons cases involving visitors unfamiliar with the terrain. Eventually, their bodies were discovered near the coastal path, and the reconstruction of their final moments revealed a sequence of calculated control and violence. They were confronted by a man armed with a sawed-off shotgun, restrained, and forced to comply under threat. Their bank cards were used, their PIN numbers extracted, and money withdrawn from an ATM, linking physical violence to financial exploitation in a chillingly methodical way. Afterward, both were shot at close range. The brutality of the act, combined with its apparent organization, left investigators facing a case that felt both personal and predatory, as though the victims had been selected not randomly, but opportunistically along a route known to the offender. Witness accounts from the area described a man fitting a specific description: thin build, gray hair, elongated facial features, a strong Welsh accent. But those details, while helpful, were not enough to produce identification. A sketch was created, circulated, and then slowly absorbed into the archive of unsolved cases. What no one realized at the time was that a few weeks earlier, the same man who carried out these killings had appeared on national television, smiling in front of cameras, participating in a game show that celebrated ordinary competition and light entertainment. That image would later become one of the most unsettling contradictions in British criminal history. Because the question that emerges from this sequence of events is not simply who committed these crimes, but how someone could exist in both worlds at once. The world of public entertainment and the world of hidden violence along isolated coastal paths. That tension between visibility and invisibility, between the familiar and the predatory, is where this story begins. To understand how the crimes attributed to John Cooper unfolded, it is not enough to focus only on the acts of violence themselves. It is necessary to understand the environment in which they occurred, the people who lived there, and the way ordinary life in Pembrokeshire created both visibility and blind spots. This is not a story set in a hidden underworld or a dense metropolitan maze where anonymity is expected. It takes place in a rural, coastal region of Wales, where communities are small enough that people recognize one another, yet vast enough in landscape that isolation can be absolute within minutes of walking. The coastline is dramatic and open, shaped by cliffs and long walking paths that attract both locals and visitors seeking quiet. Inland, farms and scattered houses sit along winding roads, separated by fields and stretches of unlit countryside. It is a place where silence can feel peaceful, but also where silence can conceal danger for long periods of time. In such an environment, trust is often informal rather than structured. People rely on familiarity, on the assumption that danger is something that comes from outside, not from within the same landscape where daily life unfolds. It is precisely within this assumption that John Cooper existed for much of his life. Born in Milford Haven in 1944, he was not an unknown figure drifting in from elsewhere. He was part of the same social geography as his eventual victims. This detail is important because it explains one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. He did not need to infiltrate a community as a stranger because he was already embedded within it. From an early age, Cooper's behavior marked him as volatile. Records and accounts describe repeated encounters with law enforcement, beginning in his youth and continuing into adulthood. He was known for aggression, heavy drinking, and a pattern of confrontations that escalated quickly. By his early 20s, he had already accumulated arrests for offenses including theft, public disorder, and assaults that included attacks on police officers. These were not isolated incidents, but a recurring rhythm of instability that followed him through different phases of life. In a small community, such behavior does not disappear into anonymity. It becomes part of reputation. Over time, Cooper became someone people recognized not for a profession or contribution, but for unpredictability. He was the kind of person whose presence could shift the tone of a room, not through charisma, but through the possibility of conflict. Yet even this reputation, while significant, did not translate into a coherent understanding of future risk. He was known as dangerous in a general sense, but not as someone connected to specific violent outcomes that would later define his name and national consciousness. The turning point in his life that is often cited is financial rather than psychological. In 1978, Cooper won approximately £90,000 through a competition known as Spot the Ball, a form of contest that involved predicting the location of a ball removed from a photograph. At the time, this sum represented a substantial amount of money, enough to alter one's circumstances significantly. However, rather than stabilizing his life, the windfall appears to have intensified existing patterns. Accounts indicate that the money was quickly absorbed into gambling and alcohol consumption, behaviors that had already been part of his lifestyle. When the money was gone, there was no lasting change in direction, only a return to instability. Now, without financial buffer, what followed was a gradual but steady escalation in criminal activity. Burglaries became more frequent, and the nature of his offenses shifted toward greater risk and direct confrontation. Armed robbery entered his pattern of behavior, along with continued alcohol-related volatility. These were not sudden transformations, but progressive steps that built upon each other, each incident reinforcing a trajectory rather than interrupting it. Within Pembrokeshire, awareness of Cooper's behavior varied. Some people knew him directly, others knew of him through reputation, and many likely encountered him without fully contextualizing what they were seeing. This is a crucial aspect of rural communities. Familiarity does not always equal clarity. A person can be known socially without being understood in terms of risk. Cooper's presence therefore existed in a space between visibility and underestimation. By the mid-1980s, this accumulation of behavior had formed a profile recognizable to those who paid attention. He was not simply a petty criminal. He was someone with a documented history of aggression, instability, and repeated offenses. Yet even with this knowledge, there was no structural mechanism that connected his past actions to the kind of predatory violence that would later emerge in a different context. The environment did not anticipate serial violence emerging from someone already embedded within it. Against this backdrop, the lives of Richard Thomas and Helen Thomas unfolded in relative isolation at Scufston Park near Milford Haven. They lived in a rural estate setting that, by its nature, suggested separation from urban risk. Their home was not located in a densely populated area where intrusion might be frequent or expected. Instead, it stood within a landscape that implied privacy and distance. This sense of distance, however, is not the same as safety. On the night of December 22, 1985, that assumption was violently disrupted when John Cooper entered their home. The initial intent appears to have been burglary, a continuation of his established criminal pattern. However, the situation escalated inside the property, transforming from intrusion into lethal violence. Cooper used a shotgun to kill both Richard and Helen Thomas within their home. After the killings, he set fire to the building in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. The fire consumed much of the structure before emergency services arrived, reducing the physical space of the crime to ruins and complicating any attempt at reconstruction. When investigators later examined the scene, they were confronted not with clarity, but with destruction. The fire had removed much of what might have provided insight into sequence, timing, or additional forensic detail. In the absence of witnesses and with limited physical evidence surviving, the case initially appeared to fit the category of a failed burglary that had escalated into double homicide. There was no immediate suspect who could be definitively linked to the scene, and no forensic breakthrough that could move the investigation forward. As a result, the case did not progress in any meaningful way. It remained unresolved, effectively frozen in time, one of many violent incidents that could not be conclusively solved with the investigative tools available at the time. For years later, in June 1989, a second set of victims would enter the same geographic narrative under completely different circumstances. Peter Dixon and Gwenda Dixon were visiting Pembrokeshire as tourists, experiencing the region through its coastal walking paths. Their presence in the area reflected a different relationship to the landscape, not permanence, but temporary engagement with its natural beauty. They were not residents embedded in local networks, but visitors moving through open spaces designed for exploration and leisure. On June 29, 1989, they set out on a walk along a coastal path and did not return. Their disappearance initiated a large-scale search operation, reflecting both the visibility of missing tourists and the urgency of uncertainty in an environment where terrain could be unpredictable. Eventually, their bodies were discovered near the coastal path, and the investigation that followed reconstructed a sequence of controlled and deliberate violence. Cooper confronted the couple with a sawed-off shotgun, restrained them, and forced compliance through threat. He then used their bank cards to withdraw money, requiring them to provide their PIN numbers, introducing a financial dimension to the crime that extended beyond immediate violence. After the withdrawal, both victims were shot at close range. The combination of coercion, financial exploitation, and execution-style killing established a pattern that investigators would later recognize as part of a broader behavioral signature. A witness in the area had observed a man matching a general description near the scene: thin build, gray hair, elongated facial structure, and a strong Welsh accent. A police sketch was produced based on these accounts, circulated in an effort to identify a suspect. However, despite these efforts, the identity behind the description remained unknown. What tied these two sets of victims together, Richard and Helen Thomas, and Peter and Gwenda Dixon, was not only geography or timing, but the presence of a single individual whose actions moved between burglary, violence, and control. Yet at the time, these connections were not visible. Each case existed independently in investigative files, separated by years, methods, and circumstances. The broader pattern would only become visible much later, when time, technology, and persistence allowed fragmented evidence to be reconsidered as part of a single narrative. By the time the events of Pembrokeshire began to unfold into what would later be recognized as a connected pattern of violence, nothing about the individual incidents immediately revealed the presence of a single controlling hand behind them. Each crime appeared, at the time, as an isolated rupture in an otherwise quiet rural landscape. The murders of Richard and Helen Thomas in 1985 were treated as a brutal intrusion into a private estate, a case shaped by fire, destruction, and uncertainty. The later disappearance and killing of Peter and Gwenda Dixon in 1989 appear to be a separate tragedy altogether, one tied to the vulnerability of tourists moving through remote coastal terrain. What investigators did not yet have was the ability to link these events through a consistent behavioral signature supported by forensic continuity. Instead, they were left with fragments, scenes burned, witnesses uncertain, and a suspect who, at that stage, remained unidentified. The first of these incidents, the Scufston Park murders, began with what appeared to be a property intrusion. On December 22, 1985, Richard Thomas, aged 58, and Helen Thomas, aged 56, were inside their rural estate home near Milford Haven. The property itself, isolated and quiet, offered a sense of separation from the outside world. Yet that separation would not provide protection. John Cooper entered the property with the intent of burglary, a continuation of his established pattern of criminal activity involving theft and intrusion. However, inside the house, the situation escalated into lethal violence. Both Richard and Helen Thomas were shot with a shotgun inside their home. The precise sequence of confrontation is not fully recoverable due to the destruction that followed. But the outcome is clear: both occupants were killed. After the killings, Cooper set fire to the property. The fire was not incidental. It functioned as an active attempt to destroy physical evidence. When emergency services arrived, they were met with a structure already engulfed in flames. The intensity of the fire meant that much of the interior was destroyed, significantly limiting what forensic investigators could recover. In the aftermath, the investigation struggled to move beyond initial assumptions. Without clear witnesses, without usable forensic material, and with a crime scene heavily compromised by fire, the case was interpreted as a burglary that had escalated into violence. This interpretation shaped the early trajectory of the investigation, anchoring it in a framework that did not yet account for broader behavioral patterns or potential repetition. As a result, the case gradually lost momentum, not because it was resolved, but because it reached the limits of what could be extracted from the available evidence at the time. It entered a state of suspension, unresolved and effectively silent within the broader system of unsolved crimes. For years later, a different but structurally similar pattern emerged along the coastal paths of Pembrokeshire. On June 29, 1989, Peter Dixon, aged 51, and Gwenda Dixon, aged 52, were walking along a coastal route during a holiday visit to the region. Unlike the previous victims, they were not residents tied to a fixed location. They were visitors moving through a landscape known for its scenic walking routes and open coastal views. Their disappearance began as a missing persons case, prompting search efforts across the region. The terrain, while visually open, also contained areas of isolation where visibility was limited, and it was in such a space that their final encounter occurred. Their bodies were later discovered near the coastal path, confirming that they had been subjected to a violent attack. The reconstruction of the events that followed was built from forensic findings and subsequent investigative analysis. Cooper confronted the couple using a sawed-off shotgun, a weapon that allowed for close-range control and intimidation. He restrained them and compelled compliance, forcing them to provide their bank card PIN numbers. This detail introduced a distinct element into the crime: financial exploitation occurring alongside physical violence. The use of the victim's banking information indicates a level of deliberation beyond immediate assault, extending the event into a sequence of actions involving movement, control, and withdrawal of money from an ATM. After these steps, both Peter and Gwenda Dixon were shot at close range, resulting in their deaths. The combination of coercion, theft, and execution established a pattern of behavior that, in hindsight, would become significant in linking the case to other violent incidents in the region. At the time, however, this pattern was not yet recognized as part of a broader sequence. Instead, investigators were confronted with a highly disturbing but seemingly isolated double homicide. A witness in the area provided an account of a man seen near the coastal path around the relevant time. The description included specific physical characteristics: a thin build, gray hair, an elongated facial structure, and a strong Welsh accent. Based on this information, a police sketch was created and circulated. Despite this effort, no immediate identification was made. The suspect remained unknown, and the case, while actively investigated, did not produce a breakthrough. What is critical in understanding this stage of events is the separation between knowledge and connection. Investigators possessed details of individual crimes, witness statements, and physical evidence. But they did not yet possess a framework that unified these elements into a single offender profile. The crimes existed as discrete events within investigative files, each requiring separate attention, each interpreted through the lens of its immediate circumstances. Even the presence of a similar geographic region did not initially produce a strong inference of linkage, as rural violent crime does not always follow predictable repetition patterns. At this point, John Cooper remained outside the investigative focus for these murders. Despite his existing criminal history and known presence within the same general region, the absence of forensic technology capable of linking trace evidence across time meant that earlier assumptions persisted longer than they might in a modern investigative environment. As a result, Cooper's identity remained disconnected from the growing body of violent incidents. It is only in later years, through the application of advanced forensic analysis and the re-examination of archived evidence, that the structural continuity between these events would begin to emerge. At the time of their occurrence, however, the murders of 1985 and 1989 remained separated by interpretation, geography, and investigative limitation, waiting for a future moment when they could finally be understood as part of a single, coherent pattern of violence. For more than a decade after the murders of Richard and Helen Thomas and Peter and Gwenda Dixon, the cases remain suspended in a state that is often the most difficult for investigators and families alike. Not solved, not actively progressing, but also not closed. They existed in archives, in evidence rooms, and in the memories of those who had worked them, gradually becoming what law enforcement refers to as cold cases. With the passage of time erodes not only physical evidence, but also the clarity of human recollection. In Pembrokeshire, however, the sense of unease never fully disappeared. Even without a named perpetrator, the pattern of violence left behind a psychological imprint on the region. Two double murders, separated by years and circumstance, both involving isolation, control, and sudden lethal force, suggested a predator who understood the geography and vulnerabilities of the area. Yet without forensic continuity, that suggestion remained speculative. The breakthrough would not come from a new crime, but from a decision made decades later to reopen old wounds with new tools. In 2006, Detective Superintendent Steve Wilkins made a decision that would ultimately transform the trajectory of the investigation. He reopened the Pembrokeshire murder cases, not because new evidence had emerged, but because advances in forensic science and investigative methodology made it possible to re-examine old material with a different level of precision. This was not a routine review. It was a deliberate attempt to reconstruct cases that had long since stalled. The process began with a comprehensive audit of archive case files. Boxes of documents, statements, and forensic exhibits were retrieved from storage and reassessed. What had once been considered unusable or inconclusive evidence was now subjected to modern testing. Techniques that did not exist at the time of the original investigations. The focus was not on finding entirely new evidence, but on extracting meaning from what already existed. One of the key challenges in cold case investigation is fragmentation. Evidence collected at the time of a crime is often stored under conditions that preserve physical integrity but not interpretive value. Without the technological framework to analyze it properly, such evidence remains dormant. Wilkins and his team approached the Pembrokeshire cases with the understanding that even the smallest trace, fibers, microscopic biological material, or ballistic residue could potentially carry significance if examined through modern forensic methods. Among the most critical developments in this renewed investigation was the involvement of forensic scientist Angela Gallup. whose expertise in cold case analysis had already contributed to the resolution of other long-standing investigations. Her role was not to reinterpret the narrative of the crimes, but to interrogate the physical evidence with a level of scientific scrutiny that could either confirm or eliminate potential connections. The process involved re-examining items recovered from both crime scenes, particularly clothing and materials that had been preserved from the victims and any associated objects. In the case of Peter Dixon, a crucial piece of evidence emerged. A minute trace of blood found on a pair of shorts belonging to John Cooper. This was not a visible stain or a large biological sample. It was a microscopic fragment, detectable only through advanced DNA profiling techniques developed long after the original investigation. The significance of this finding lay not in its size, but in its specificity. It created a direct biological link between Cooper and one of the victims of the 1989 coastal murders, a connection that had not been possible to establish during the initial investigation due to technological limitations. In parallel with biological evidence, ballistic analysis provided another critical line of inquiry. The weapon used in the Dixon murders, a sawed-off shotgun, was re-examined in relation to firearms associated with John Cooper. Through detailed forensic comparison, investigators determined that the characteristics of the weaponry and ammunition patterns were consistent with firearms linked to him through other criminal activity. This did not rely on a single piece of evidence, but on the accumulation of technical consistencies that, when combined, strengthened the case for association. At this stage, the investigation began to shift from a series of isolated murders toward a unified hypothesis that a single offender was responsible for multiple violent crimes across Pembrokeshire over an extended period of time. However, even with forensic evidence building, the identity of that offender required further confirmation through circumstantial and historical linkage. It was at this point that investigators returned to a source of evidence that had once seemed incidental: television footage. John Cooper's appearance on the ITV game show Bullseye in 1989 had originally been recorded as entertainment, a brief moment in which an ordinary contestant participated in a televised competition. There was nothing in the broadcast itself that suggested criminality. However, in the context of renewed investigation, the footage became something entirely different. When compared against the earlier police sketch of the suspect seen near the coastal path, investigators identified striking similarities in facial structure and general appearance. More significantly, the combination of physical characteristics and regional accent matched the descriptions provided by witnesses from the Dixon case. The transformation of this footage from entertainment archive to investigative tool represented a critical shift in the case. It demonstrated how modern investigation often relies not only on physical evidence, but on the recontextualization of existing media within new analytical frameworks, with biological, ballistic, and visual evidence beginning to align. Investigators were able to construct a far more coherent profile of the suspect than had ever been possible during the original investigations. John Cooper, who had by this time already been convicted for unrelated offenses and was serving a prison sentence, emerged as the central figure connecting multiple unresolved crimes in Pembrokeshire. The investigative momentum continued to build as additional historical material was reviewed. Patterns in burglary reports, violent incidents, and geographical proximity began to align with known movements and behavior attributed to Cooper during the relevant time periods. Each piece of evidence on its own was not definitive, but together they formed a structured narrative of repeated violent conduct. The final phase of the investigation involved synthesizing these strands into a prosecutable case. This required not only scientific validation, but also legal scrutiny to ensure that evidence, collected decades apart, could withstand courtroom examination. By the time the case reached this stage, the The investigation had evolved far beyond its original scope. It was no longer simply about solving two double murders. It had become an attempt to reconstruct a hidden pattern of violence that had remained undetected for years due to technological and procedural limitations. The reopening of the Pembrokeshire cases demonstrated a fundamental principle of cold case investigation. That time does not erase evidence, but often conceals it until the tools exist to reveal it. In this case, those tools, DNA profiling, ballistic reanalysis, and archival reconstruction, allowed investigators to bridge the gap between past uncertainty and present understanding. What had once been a collection of unresolved tragedies was now forming into a single investigative narrative, centered on a suspect whose identity, though long suspected in local circles, was finally being supported by scientific and circumstantial convergence. The stage was now set for the final transition from investigation to arrest, and from suspicion to formal legal accountability. By the time the case against John Cooper reached the courtroom, it was no longer a fragmented collection of cold case files or isolated historical tragedies. It had become a unified prosecution built on decades of overlooked connections, scientific advancements, and the painstaking reconstruction of events that had once seemed irretrievable. The arrest itself, carried out in 2009, had taken place quietly. Cooper was detained while walking near his home, an ordinary moment interrupted by the weight of extraordinary history. For a man whose crimes had remained hidden for so long behind gaps in evidence and time, the arrest marked the point at which those gaps finally closed. What followed was not a sudden revelation, but a careful and methodical presentation of evidence designed to withstand the highest level of legal scrutiny. The trial, held in 2011, became one of the most significant criminal proceedings in Wales in recent memory, not only because of the brutality of the crimes under examination, but because of the way in which they had been reconstructed across such a long temporal distance. In court, the prosecution did not rely on a single narrative thread, but on the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence that, when combined, formed a coherent picture of repeated violent conduct. At the center of this case were four murders: Richard Thomas and Helen Thomas in 1985, and Peter Dixon and Gwenda Dixon in 1989. These were not presented as separate, unrelated tragedies, but as part of a sustained pattern of behavior attributed to John Cooper. The prosecution described him as a man who engaged in burglary, violence, sexual assault, and murder not as isolated acts, but as part of a broader criminal continuum. The courtroom heard how Cooper's actions extended beyond violence into control and exploitation, particularly in the Dixon case, where financial coercion was used alongside physical force. One of the most powerful aspects of the prosecution's case was the scientific evidence that had only become available decades after the crimes were committed. DNA analysis played a central role, particularly the identification of microscopic biological material linking Cooper directly to one of the victims. This evidence, while physically minimal, carried significant legal weight because of its specificity and reliability. It was not presented as circumstantial inference, but as direct forensic connection. Alongside this, ballistic evidence was introduced to demonstrate the consistency between the weapon used in the murders and firearms associated with Cooper. The analysis of shotgun patterns and weapon characteristics provided another layer of corroboration, reinforcing the argument that a single offender was responsible for multiple violent incidents across the region. These scientific elements were crucial because they bridged the gap between historical uncertainty and present-day certainty, allowing the prosecution to present evidence that would have been impossible to obtain at the time of the original investigations. However, the case was not built solely on forensic science. The prosecution also relied heavily on witness testimony and historical reconstruction. Survivors of Cooper's later attacks in 1996 provided accounts of his behavior, including the use of firearms, threats of lethal violence, and sexual assault. These testimonies helped establish a behavioral pattern consistent with the methods observed in the earlier murders. They also provided the court with a more complete understanding of the defendant's escalation over time, demonstrating that the violence in Pembrokeshire did not exist in isolation but formed part of a broader trajectory. The court also examined Cooper's criminal history, which included burglary, robbery, and previous acts of violence. While prior convictions are not used to prove specific acts in most legal systems, they can provide context for behavioral patterns, particularly when supported by independent forensic evidence. In this case, the historical record helps situate Cooper within a continuum of escalating criminal activity that aligned with the timeline of the murders under investigation. One of the most striking elements presented during the trial was the integration of media evidence, particularly Cooper's appearance on the television game show Bullseye in 1989. Although originally recorded as entertainment, the footage had been reanalyzed during the investigation and compared with witness descriptions and police sketches from the Dixon case. The prosecution did not present this footage as proof of guilt on its own, but as corroborated material that strengthened the identification of Cooper as the suspect seen near the coastal path. The juxtaposition of this footage with the severity of the crimes under discussion created a psychological tension within the courtroom, highlighting the contrast between public appearance and private violence. Throughout the proceedings, the defense challenged the reliability of evidence collected decades after the crimes, questioning whether contamination, misinterpretation, or investigative bias could have influenced the findings. However, the prosecution countered this by emphasizing the independence of the evidence streams. DNA, ballistic analysis, witness testimony, and historical records were each derived from separate sources and examined through different methodologies. The strength of the case, they argued, did not lie in any single piece of evidence, but in the convergence of all of them pointing toward the same conclusion. As the trial progressed, the narrative of the case became increasingly clear. What had once been perceived as separate incidents of rural violence was now being presented as the work of a single offender operating over a span of years. The courtroom was not simply evaluating individual acts, but reconstructing a pattern that had remained hidden due to the limitations of earlier investigative techniques. On May 26, 2011, the court delivered its verdict. John Cooper was found guilty of 4 counts of murder, along with charges of rape, sexual assault, and multiple counts of burglary and robbery. The judge's remarks reflected the gravity of the crimes and the suffering inflicted upon the victims. Cooper was sentenced to 4 whole life orders, meaning he would never be eligible for parole and would remain in prison for the rest of his life. The legal outcome marked the final closure of a process that had begun more than 2 decades earlier, but did not erase the historical reality of the time lost between crime and conviction. For the families of Richard Thomas, Helen Thomas, Peter Dixon, and Gwenda Dixon, the verdict represented acknowledgement and accountability, but also a reminder of the years during which answers had not been available. For investigators, it represented the culmination of years of work that had required revisiting old assumptions, re-examining forgotten evidence, and integrating scientific advancements into historical cases. The trial also underscored the evolving nature of criminal justice. It demonstrated how cases once considered unsolvable could be reopened and resolved through advances in forensic science and sustained investigative effort. At the same time, it highlighted the limitations of earlier systems, where lack of technology and fragmented information allowed violent offenders to remain unidentified for extended periods. In the end, the conviction of John Cooper was not only the resolution of a series of murders, but also a demonstration of how justice can emerge across time, even when delayed by decades. The courtroom did not restore what had been lost, but it did establish a definitive record of responsibility. And in doing so, it transformed what had once been a set of unanswered questions into a concluded history, anchored in evidence, testimony, and legal judgment. By the time the case of John Cooper reached its conclusion in law, the violence it examined already belonged to the past, but not in any sense that allowed it to fade or soften. Instead, it remained fixed in the collective memory of Pembrokeshire and in the professional memory of the investigators who had spent years reconstructing it. The conviction in 2011 did not return life to the victims, nor did it restore the years in which answers were absent, but it did establish something that had been missing for decades: certainty. Richard Thomas, Helen Thomas, Peter Dixon, and Gwenda Dixon were no longer names attached to unresolved files. They were officially recognized victims of a single offender whose actions had finally been proven beyond reasonable doubt. Yet even with legal closure, the impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. In the communities where these crimes occurred, the sense of vulnerability lingered in subtle but persistent ways. Pembrokeshire was, and remains, a region defined by its landscape: open coastlines, rural roads, quiet walking paths, and isolated properties. These are the same features that make it attractive to visitors and residents alike. But they are also the features that shape the conditions in which the crimes were possible. The idea that such violence could occur in spaces commonly associated with peace and recreation left a lasting impression on public consciousness. People who had once walked those coastal paths or lived in similar rural isolation were forced to reconsider the assumption that familiarity with a place equates to safety within it. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case is not only the brutality of the crimes, but the long period during which they remained disconnected from one another. For years, the murders of 1985 and 1989 existed as separate investigative challenges, each constrained by the limitations of forensic science at the time. The fire that destroyed the Scuffston Park crime scene eliminated much of the physical evidence that might have allowed earlier identification of the perpetrator. Similarly, the Dixon murders occurred in a context where witness testimony and partial descriptions were insufficient to establish identity. Without DNA profiling, without advanced ballistic comparison, and without the ability to cross-reference fragmented data across multiple cases, the investigative system of the time was unable to see the underlying continuity. It was only through the application of later scientific methods that these fragments could be reassembled into a coherent structure. This transformation of understanding speaks to a broader shift in modern criminal investigation. The reopening of the Pembrokeshire cases in 2006 demonstrated that cold cases are not static. They are archives waiting for the development of tools capable of interpreting them differently. Under the direction of Steve Wilkins, and with the forensic expertise of specialists such as Angela Gallup, evidence that had once been considered insufficient was re-examined with renewed precision. The discovery of microscopic DNA traces, the reassessment of ballistic evidence, and the careful reconstruction of behavioral patterns all contributed to a case that was no longer speculative but evidentially grounded. Yet, even with scientific clarity, the emotional weight of the case remained complex. For investigators, there was the recognition that had these tools existed earlier, the timeline of events might have been different. For families, there was the difficult reality that justice, while achieved, arrived long after it could provide immediate relief. For the public, there was the unsettling realization that a person capable of such sustained violence had lived within a familiar landscape, blending into ordinary life while committing acts of extraordinary brutality. The figure of John Cooper himself became a symbol of this contradiction. His appearance on the television program Bullseye in 1989 remains one of the most striking elements of the case. Not because the program itself had any connection to the crimes, but because it captured an unremarkable moment of visibility that contrasted sharply with the hidden reality of his actions. In that broadcast, he appeared as a participant in a familiar entertainment format, engaging in light conversation and public competition. Nothing in that moment indicated the violence that would later be attributed to him. Yet in retrospect, that footage became a point of psychological tension for those studying the case. A reminder that dangerous individuals do not always present themselves in ways that align with expectation. The final legal outcome, 4 whole life orders, ensured that Cooper would never be released from prison. In practical terms, this meant permanent removal from society without the possibility of parole. However, legal permanence does not equate to narrative closure. The case continues to be studied not only for its criminal elements, but for what it reveals about investigative evolution, forensic progress, and the limitations of earlier policing methods. It also continues to be referenced in discussions about cold case resolution, particularly in how advancements in DNA technology and evidence preservation can transform previously unsolved investigations. There is also the matter of unresolved possibility. While Cooper was convicted of 4 murders, some investigators have suggested that he may have been responsible for additional violent crimes that were never formally proven. These suggestions, however, remain unconfirmed and legally untested. They exist in the space between suspicion and evidence, highlighting again the importance of distinguishing between what can be demonstrated in court and what remains speculative in investigative memory. In 2023, Cooper attempted to challenge aspects of his conviction through legal review processes, but there has been no indication of any successful appeal. The strength of the evidence presented in 2011 has remained intact under subsequent scrutiny, reinforcing the finality of the original verdict. The case has also entered cultural memory through dramatization, most notably in the television adaptation The Pembrokeshire Murders. While dramatization necessarily condenses and interprets events for narrative purposes, its existence reflects a broader public interest in understanding how such crimes can occur and how they can eventually be solved. It also reflects the enduring impact of the case on public consciousness in Wales and beyond. In the end, the story of John Cooper is not only a story of violence, but also a story of time. Time in which crimes remained unsolved, time in which evidence lay dormant, and time in which justice was delayed but not denied. It is a reminder that the absence of answers does not necessarily mean the absence of truth, but often the absence of means to uncover it. When those means finally arrive, they do not change what happened, but they do change what is known. And in cases like this, that distinction becomes the closest form of resolution that history can offer. There is a final layer to the story of John Cooper that cannot be measured in verdicts, forensic reports, or even the reconstruction of timelines. It exists instead in what remains after a case has formally ended. The psychological residue left in a community, the professional reflection left among investigators, and the uneasy awareness that some crimes are not defined solely by their brutality, but by how long they remain hidden in plain sight. Even after Cooper was sentenced to 4 whole life orders in 2011, the narrative did not simply close. It settled instead into a quieter but more enduring form of presence, one shaped by reflection rather than discovery. In Pembrokeshire, the landscapes connected to the crimes did not change. The coastal paths where Peter and Gwenda Dixon once walked remain open, still drawing visitors who may not be aware of the full history of the ground beneath their feet. The rural estate areas near Milford Haven continue to exist as part of ordinary life, where homes stand at the edge of fields and roads wind through familiar countryside. Nothing in the physical environment carries an obvious marker of what occurred there. And yet, for those who know the case, these locations are no longer neutral. They are layered with memory, transformed by knowledge that violence once unfolded in spaces otherwise associated with calm and routine. This duality, the coexistence of everyday life and historical violence, is one of the most enduring aspects of a case. It forces a difficult recognition that danger does not always announce itself through obvious signals, and that the boundaries between normality and harm are not always visible until they are examined in retrospect. John Cooper's life and crimes have therefore become not only a subject of criminal investigation, but also a case study in perception. He was not a figure who lived entirely outside society. He was embedded within it, moving through familiar environments, participating in ordinary public moments, and at times appearing in contexts that carried no association with violence, such as his televised appearance on Bullseye. That contrast remains one of the most psychologically difficult elements of the case to reconcile. It challenges assumptions about how risk is identified and how offenders are mentally categorized before they are known to law enforcement. Within investigative circles, the Pembrokeshire case is often discussed in terms of its methodological significance. It demonstrates how long-term cold case resolution depends not only on new technology, but on institutional willingness to revisit assumptions that were once considered final. The reopening of the case in 2006 required more than forensic advancement. It required the decision to question whether earlier interpretations of evidence had reached their true limits. Once that question was asked, the entire structure of the investigation became open to reconstruction. The role of individuals such as Detective Superintendent Steve Wilkins and forensic expert Angela Gallup is frequently emphasized in this context, not because they alone solve the case, but because their work exemplified the persistence and interdisciplinary collaboration required to bring historical cases into resolution. Their efforts illustrate how modern investigations often depend on the integration of multiple disciplines. Traditional detective work, forensic science, archival research, and technological analysis. Each element alone is insufficient. Together, they form a system capable of revisiting the past with greater clarity than was ever previously possible. From a broader perspective, the case also highlights the limitations of earlier investigative eras. In the 1980s and early 1990s, the tools available to police were significantly constrained compared to those used decades later. DNA profiling was not yet developed to its current sensitivity. Ballistic comparison methods were less precise. Data storage and cross-case analysis were limited by paper-based systems and fragmented record keeping. As a result, patterns that might now be recognized quickly could remain invisible for years. In the Pembrokeshire murders, this meant that violent incidents that were later understood as connected were initially treated as separate events, each confined to its own investigative framework. This structural limitation did not result from negligence, but from the technological boundaries of the time. However, its consequences were profound, allowing a violent offender to remain undetected across multiple serious crimes. There's also a human dimension to consider that extends beyond investigative procedure. For the families of the victims, the passage of time between the crimes and their resolution represents a complex emotional reality. Justice, when it arrived, was definitive in legal terms, but it could not restore the intervening years during which answers were absent. The verdict provided recognition and accountability, but it also underscored how long that recognition had been delayed. In cases of historical violence, closure is therefore never absolute. It is always accompanied by the awareness of what could not be changed. In cultural terms, The case has become part of a wider narrative about hidden violence in ordinary settings. The dramatization of the events in the Pembrokeshire murders brought renewed public attention to the investigation, but it also simplified a process that, in reality, was far more gradual and uncertain. Public retellings often focus on breakthrough moments, the DNA match, the television footage, the arrest, but the actual investigation was defined by years of incremental work, repeated review, and the accumulation of small evidential gains that only became meaningful when viewed collectively. This distinction is important because it reflects a broader truth about complex investigations. They are rarely defined by single moments of revelation, but by sustained effort over time. Ultimately, the story of John Cooper is not only about the crimes he committed, but about the systems that eventually exposed them. It is about how evidence survives beyond the moment of its creation, waiting for conditions in which it can be properly understood. It is also about how communities interpret safety, how investigators reconstruct fragmented histories, and how time itself can function both as an obstacle and as an instrument of clarity. The final reflection that remains is not centered on the offender, but on what his case reveals about the nature of justice in long-term investigations. Justice, in this context, is not immediate. It is cumulative. It is built across years, sometimes decades, through the slow convergence of facts that were once separated by circumstance. And when it finally arrives, it does not erase the past. It only makes it fully visible.